to hear the talk by my friend and colleague, Ronald.
These are students, Walter. You probably have to. Excuse me.
Oh, eventually they'll stop. I mean, but I'm delighted for a number of reasons. One of them personal, because Ron is my friend, and I sort of prayed and hoped that I will see him back actively doing scholarship. He is the Joe Louis of medical history. He has beaten back two very, very, very threatening conditions, and he is back doing his scholarship. So I am absolutely delighted to see my friend here. He is a Detroit original. He was born and grew up in Detroit and was educated at Wayne State University, UCLA, University of Michigan, and Brandeis University, where he earned a PhD in the history of ideas. He studied with the likes of William Barrett, Kate Smith, and Herbert Marcuse. But he was deeply involved in the revolution of the 60s. He became a community organizer in the African American neighborhood of New Brunswick, New Jersey, and an editor of the prominent New Left journal, Studies in the Left. In the spring of 1968, as he was completing a doctoral dissertation on art and freedom in the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, he participated in the Freedom School, organized in the aftermath of the student strike at Columbia. So he has street creds as an activist scholar. He has taught at Wayne State University since 1968, first at Monteith College. So of you who've never heard of this college would know that this was a very distinguished college. It was very famous throughout the country for its liberal arts program. And in 1978, he joined the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, which was a nationally recognized program for working adults, which unfortunately was discontinued by the Board of Governors in 2007. He is now a distinguished professor of the history of ideas in the Department of History. There are only 23 distinguished professors in this university. Two of them are present right now, and Ron is one of them. And he has been a winner of several scholarly and teaching awards at Wayne State University, and he was the past president of the Academy of Scholars. And those of you who don't know about that, you have to be extremely brilliant and productive to be a member of that group. I'm going to skip a lot of his resume here because, as you would expect, somebody as distinguished as him has a very long resume. But I want to let you know that he is the editor of 9 books, that he is an internationally recognized authority on Jean-Paul Sartre. His latest book is Living Without God, New Directions for Atheists, Agnostics, Secularists, and the Undecided. And other recent books include Camus and Sartre, The Story of a Friendship and the Quarrel That Never Ended, After Marxism, and he has published articles in the New Nation, Book Forum, Yale Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Washington Post, International Herald Tribune, the Toronto Star, and many others. He's also a documentary producer. He has produced televised political debates on democratic values. He's a co-producer of a feature-length documentary film entitled Professional Revolutionary about the legendary Detroit social and political activist Saul Wellman. And most recently, First Amendment on Trial, the case of the Detroit Six, which focused on the federal government's trial of Michigan's Communist Party leaders in the 50s. So as you could see, he is a very distinguished scholar, and that we are extremely, extremely delighted, lucky to have him speak to us today. And this is not to mention what a great friend he has been to this Humanities Center. This is about his third or fourth Brownback talk. He served as a resident scholar in the center, and during that period, he served as a mentor to young faculty. He is an extremely nice man who is also my gym buddy. So I am delighted to introduce to you my friend and colleague who will speak to you on Occupy Wall Street, Answers the Tea Party's New Individualism. I give you Professor Ronald Aronson.
Thank you, Walter, and thank all of you for showing up. I figured the Occupy Detroit, Occupy Wall Street connection would draw some attention, as well it should. I'm writing about it in the connection with my current book project, which is called Reconstructing Hope. Hope, as I analyze it, is that active, world-changing social energy. And in the book, I'm asking, what can it be today, after the Holocaust, after Marxism, after progress, and after 35 years of assault on the social democratic welfare state compromise that created the golden age from 1945 to 1975 in Western countries. The recent history of hope in the United States begins with the seething anger against all things Bush, especially the groundless waste of thousands of lives and hundreds of billions of dollars, both going on today as we sit here, in the invasion and occupation of Iraq. The fact that Bush and his poodle Tony Blair ignored the coordinated worldwide demonstrations of millions, perhaps tens of millions, in February 2003 against their cynically choreographed war, told the world that such hopeful and responsible mobilization no longer mattered. And so, hope you can believe in, remember that, came to be the very precisely calibrated motto of the campaign that sprang from nowhere 4 years later by a previously unknown African-American senator with a foreign-sounding name. Nominated and elected amidst a massive movement-style mobilization, especially of young people, inspired by his person, his intelligence, and his eloquence. Obama aroused enormous hope that he might be able to break through the increasingly conservative, increasingly blocked, and increasingly vicious political culture of the past generation. And at this time, mass activism might make a difference by electing a committed and far-sighted person. But such expectations were disillusioned in stages, as Obama turned to Wall Street to run the economy, missed the opportunity for a New Deal with his timid stimulus, supported an insurance company-based health plan, escalated the war in Afghanistan, and until the 2012 election came into view, showed himself unable to do battle with a Republican opposition determined to scuttle him. For all his rhetoric about change, it became clear that Obama saw himself managing the system pretty much as it was. Paradoxically, for 3 years after the bank crisis of 2008, until Occupy Wall Street began 2 months ago, the only mass response of any significance was the Tea Party, built on selfishness as the highest good. It represented a nadir of the recent history of hope, an individualist rebellion against the socialist Obama and any use of the government to promote the common good. It expressed the rejection of collective hope by large numbers of Americans over the past generation. In just 2 years' time, the Tea Party riveted the attention of the media, created havoc at town hall meetings on health care reform, entered candidates in the midterm primaries, elected members of Congress and even senators. Then it became a force to be reckoned with in negotiations over the debt ceiling, and now the 2012 elections. The many explanations for its spectacular growth tend to stress the familiar. Funding by the Koch brothers and Dick Armey's Freedom Works, key roles played by leading Republicans and long-term right-wing activists, inspiration and promotion by Fox News, involvement of crackpots, gun nuts, pseudo-patriots, and racist Obama haters. A movement of haves pitting themselves against have-nots. As important as these aspects have been, we cannot understand this startling movement without looking beyond its familiar physiognomy to focus on what is distinctly new about the Tea Party. The Tea Party gives aggressive political shape to what I want to stress is a new 21st century individualism. New in the fact that it emerged without its premises being seriously challenged from the left, in its angry intensity, and in its impossibly nostalgic and sweeping distortion of reality. It doesn't project fascism, as many on the left have sort of said in alarm, but rather an anachronistic and self-obsessed denial of the interdependence and complexity that are part and parcel of any advanced society. Tea parties, in other words, assert American right-wing ideas, not only in their most pure, simple-minded, and primitive forms, but as if they believe them. And the Great Recession has taught us, and the Occupy movements remind us anew, no contemporary society can function based on these ideas. They are fundamentally lies and illusions, justifications for privilege. The Tea Party originated in and keeps at its center a furious outburst against social solidarity. In response to widespread calls for government action to meet the crisis, they demanded no action at all. In the face of massive unemployment, they called for lower taxes and less government. But the bizarre fact is that these mostly middle and upper middle class college-educated white males over 45, 1/5 of them are earning over $100,000, have occupied center stage up until 2 months ago with their demands and their ideas. The fact that during the 3 years before Occupy Wall Street began, the Great Recession produced no other American movement points to a very deep historical problem. Americans live, again, amidst a long-term erosion of social connection, and, until very recently, in a pervasive sense of futility about the possibility of meaningful, that is, more democratic and more egalitarian change. It is contemporary American life that's produced the Tea Party's logic. Individual hope, an aggressive withdrawal into private pursuits while unrestrained economic individualism sends the world to the dogs. The Tea Party is only the product of the wider pattern. What is the wider pattern? Moving from cities to outlying areas, from Rust Belt to Sun Belt, of Americans reinventing themselves, of drawing their children out of the public schools in order to give them the best chance in life. All this accompanying deregulation of the economy and allowing the unproductive financial sector to become the place where fortunes are made. Carrying personal and economic self-regarding activity to its logical conclusion, what, after all, does the Tea Party libertarianism project? A non-society where greed rules, a war of all against all, where collective responses to individual conditions are unthinkable. To collective conditions are unthinkable. Where individuals bring up their children to avoid being losers and to learn the techniques for struggling effectively in this Hobbesian world against everyone else. In part, it's the context that makes this individualism new. If the Tea Party was the first mass response to the crisis that began in 2008, this is because there was no meaningful left in America. This absence has far-reaching roots. The disintegration of the old industrial economies and their union movements, the collapse of communism worldwide, the exhaustion of socialist parties in Europe, and the neoliberal turn by Labour, British Labour, and the Democrats in the United States. Despite the patent bankruptcy of free market globalization, there is no political force anywhere capable of ending the Great Recession. In Italy or France, Canada, or the US, there's been little possibility of thinking in leftward terms for a long time. For example, even Obama's most transformative program, health insurance, is, after all, an originally Republican measure shaped in the interest of the insurance corporations and according to an individual mandate rather than social solidarity. His response to the Great Recession was nothing like a New Deal, which implied both significant social programs and, rhetorically at least, a reshuffling of the deck that had over the years become more and more obviously stacked. Today's Democrats instead sought a stimulus directed at getting the economy running again, meaning that they were no longer able to think boldly or interested in changing the maldistribution of wealth and power that had in fact caused the Great Recession. But Obama was simply following in the footsteps, after all, of Bill Clinton, whose conservative achievements include the North American Free Trade Act, ending welfare as we know it, and the deregulation of Wall Street. The Tea Party's stress on self-reliance and responsibility is obviously a myth applied selectively and justifying class privilege. But it is a myth that has become the conventional wisdom of most of America in the past 30 years. During this time, the free market has been more and more assertively proclaimed as the magical solution to the problems of a highly complex and evolved society. And this, as more and more areas of life have been invaded by the market and the profit motive. Neoliberalism expresses several concurrent historical developments, which I've already mentioned, and have led to the decline of the left, the revival of the right, but above all, by a focused ideological campaign denying our increasing interdependence and the complexity of the economy and the marketization of more and more formerly autonomous areas. Now, scholars have discussed some aspects of the recent decline of social hope. Decline of trust in government, a lessening of civic engagement, an increase in bowling alone, the advent of the post-Fordist economy, what's called the risk society, and the postmodern individual. But what are the specific reasons in the generation that produced the Tea Party for their loss of social connectedness and conviction? Tony Judt, writing shortly before his death in 2010, surveyed the intellectual and political sources of the decline of the welfare state in Ill Fares the Land, and described the mania for privatization, the fetishization of the market, the attack on collective provisioning, and the rise of an exaggerated individualist sensibility. Mark Lilla, in a seminal essay attempting to explain the Tea Party in the New York Review of Books, focuses on what he understands as today's individualism. Ignoring the New Left as a political movement, he takes the 1960s cultural revolution as its first major source. Because, as he says, this transformed all Western societies, overturning patriarchy in the family, giving women and gays control over their bodies, challenging the authority of teachers, ending censorship, weakening traditional churches, in a word, giving individuals more autonomy in more areas of life. What Lilla calls a second revolution took place in the 1980s, under Reagan and Thatcher, successfully installing the belief in economic individualism. And now, despite their seemingly antagonistic sources, left and right, Lilla argues that the Tea Party comfortably combines both strands into a new individualism. These analyses need to be complemented by a stress on economic reasons for the assault on the welfare state that began in the mid-1970s. Marxist geographer David Harvey focuses on the rejection of the Keynesianism that had prevailed during the golden years of 1945 to 1975. He indicates a new capitalist class project that coalesced during the economic crisis of the 1970s. And I'm quoting him now. Masked by a lot of rhetoric about individual freedom, liberty, personal responsibility, and the virtues of privatization, the free market, and free trade, it legitimized draconian policies designed to restore and consolidate capitalist class power. This project has been successful, judging from the incredible centralization of wealth and power observable in all those countries that took the neoliberal road. The first mainstream ideologist of the renewed Hobbesianism was, after all, Margaret Thatcher. Her famous statement, "There is no such thing as society, only individuals and families." And since her years in power, social energy in the advanced societies, especially in the US and the UK, has been flowing less and less into collective social identities, projects, and satisfactions, and more into hundreds, thousands, millions of individual personal directions. Privatization of the self is what I call it, and its social experience, and marketization of virtually everything have become the meaning of contemporary society. In every way, from cradle to grave, we are increasingly constituted and constitute ourselves as detached beings who ignore or repress our sense of belonging to a larger society. As an important article in the News of the Week section of the New York Times pointed out this Sunday, these individuals are more and more engaged in a life project of self-marketing. We're distracted from the shrinking of collective hope by the ceaseless commercial activity of consumer capitalism, which has generated a field of dazzling possibilities for profitable individual initiative. Its great ideologist is Thomas Friedman of the New York Times. He never tires of pointing out that large numbers of individuals are now freer than ever before to live and do business as they wish, to adopt precisely religions, modes of behavior, styles, customs, and new entrepreneurial projects they wish. This is, quote-unquote, libertarianism, which expresses the sense of individuals being on their own, asking only to be left alone. Clearly, then, the individualism expressed in the Tea Party is not just a momentary phenomenon, but rather the result of major long-term trends in American society. From charter schools to gated communities to personal electronic devices to the rational choice philosophies at the heart of key academic disciplines, the new individualism has been creating facts. How to respond to this pervasive logic which we meet at every turn? Finally, the response publicly, dramatically began on September 17th with Occupy Wall Street. Building a movement for progressive change, equally obviously, depends on people experiencing themselves as, first of all, belonging to a community. This happened when isolated, angry, and fed-up individuals stopped experiencing their social pain separately and came together to see it as social pain and to do something about it. They formed a we protesting against rampant inequality, Wall Street greed, mortgage foreclosures, growing poverty, and unemployment. The occupations, which came to Detroit a month ago, involved the creation of a community of equals living together, democratically self-organized, calling for the common good, not just for themselves, but for the entire society. We are the 99%. Their radical perception, and now, after living in encampments, is that their experience as well, is that everyone's well-being is interlinked, that people depend on each other, and that collective action matters. In contrast, Tea Party individualism breathtakingly denies such fundamental facts of life. Following on a generation of neoliberal ideology, they deny what the Occupy protesters sense, that every generation and every individual is situated within human society and its vast network of historically inherited skills and structures and processes and institutions. These constitute the non-biological infrastructure of human life. We only become human by a long process raised within society, through it developing consciousness, language, fundamental skills, and access to its specific tools, its built environment and culture. Whoever and wherever we are, we start from where those who came before us left off. Our lineage of development stretching all the way from early humans learning to use fire and mostly migrating from Africa, and then forward to particular peoples, nations, religious and ethnic groups, social classes and families with their collective and individual struggles to be treated and lived more decently. It is no less profound for being a truism. All of this history is indeed our story. It becomes our very identity. At every moment of the present, in old ways and new, this social dependence is alive. Our daily survival and functioning depend on dozens, hundreds, thousands of links. We belong to family and to obvious structures, networks, and processes of work, friends, neighborhood, city, and nation, as well as the natural environment, and to a natural and social universe of which we usually remain unconscious, including those whose work daily makes us and our lives possible, just as our work in some small way contributes to making them and their lives possible. It is truer than ever that in our survival and every activity, we are utterly dependent on people, relationships, and structures everywhere in the world, and these can be mapped. Perhaps such a map can help explain the explosive anger of the Tea Party. Think of members of the middle and upper middle class most invested in the new individualist ideology, shaken like everyone by the Great Recession, facing a just elected black president who represents, in their prejudices, those least committed to individual responsibility. Having seen their Republican leaders betraying their own rhetoric by bailing out banks, and now the socialist democratic successors bailing out corporations. Now place these people in their chosen environment of the endlessly self-validating loop of the right-wing media, Fox News, for example, inventing its own reality and virtually impervious to contradiction. The Tea Party's exorbitant and passionate anger, philosopher J.M. Bernstein argues, and their attachment to wildly fantastic beliefs can be explained by the fact that the economic crisis has destroyed the illusion by which its members live. Unwilling to face the complex connected reality, they violently assert the belief that each individual, I'm quoting Bernstein now, that each individual is metaphysically self-sufficient, that one's own very standing and being as a rational agent owes nothing to other individuals or institutions. The very falsity of this belief seems to stoke its magic intensity. The anger boiled over when the quote-unquote socialist government began to push for a national health insurance system which, whatever its conservative reality, which I've mentioned, potentially undermines the current means-based non-system. Although taking a very small step towards a rational system of providing health care to everyone, none of the Democrats had the courage to honestly address the Tea Party fear of health care being rationed by saying the truth. It is already being rationed by one's ability to pay or possession of insurance, and a truly rational system must eventually have to replace this rationing by distributing health services according to socially determined criteria of need. Yes, rationing. Merely the vague and unspoken implication of a rational system was enough to drive people crazy, to spur cries of death panels among people refusing to acknowledge that their insurance was a socially obtained privilege. Refusing, that is, after a generation of individualizing experience and ideological distortion, to see how deeply dependent they are. We all are. Asserting their social acquisitions as belonging to themselves and properly earned, and blotting out the processes that made this possible, was their alternative to facing the facts. The Tea Party is a deranged movement of privilege built both on long-prepared illusion and real crisis. However, combating it, which has finally begun with the Occupy movements, entails confronting the complex historical situation of which it is an excrescence. Occupy does this by creating a community based on solidarity. This word informs any serious response to the world of the Tea Party. This is what is being created among tens of thousands of people camping out across the country and the world. It implies a reversal of the top-down class struggle of the past 35 years. It seeks to explicitly combat the era of wholesale marketization and privatization. Their taking to heart our dependence and our social being leads us to see why those most insanely loyal to the capitalist system have been screaming about socialism throughout the Great Recession. Collective solutions and equality based on a firm and frank recognition of human interdependence and social belonging continue to haunt the world as its suppressed alternative. Perhaps the subject is now finally being changed from what I need to what we need and should do to obtain it. Rebecca Solnit's descriptions of responses to disasters from the San Francisco fire to Hurricane Katrina show about the past exactly what Occupy Wall Street has been about in the present. A deeper, altruistic, and cooperative social dimension remains among us, waiting for the moment when it might become actualized. The moment is now. The occupiers are waking us up by doing it, envisioning social solutions to social problems, demanding collective and democratic citizen action against the source of our collective pain. But let's not fetishize Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Detroit. There's no privileged place for this struggle, but rather several overlapping and semi-autonomous spheres, from the political to the workplace to the cultural to daily life. It requires rethinking, talking, and arguing, as well as political action, all to be done in a spirit of solidarity that contests the individualism that has been ruining our society. Thank you. Great.
Well, what's the time for questions? Charles?
Oh,
No, I don't.
he's the boss.
Can someone raise his hand twice?
Go ahead.
Oh, well, you raised some very interesting points, particularly about the individualization of people's mentalities about society. I'm reminded of the woman on the call-in show on the radio, evidently, who called in and said, "Tell the government to keep its hands off my Social Security," which seemed to reflect the lack of awareness that it was a governmental program, or maybe the sense that the government is now the Congress and was threatening her Social Security. But I don't know, it's my Social Security. But I wonder how far back in time in our republic the strands of the Tea Party go. It is, after all, named after an era of the founding of the republic. And as I read, the War of 1812 is being memorialized this coming year, of course, in a number of books. And one of the interesting ones is Civil War of 1812 by Taylor. And he describes a situation in which you had republicanism running that war, but with an extremely decentralized and non-governmental orientation and ideology, which in a sense deprived even the forces, the military forces, of the wherewithal to fight a war. They didn't want to pay any taxes, they didn't want any central build-up, and it was a very helter-skelter affair that was disowned by the Federalists, who were, in a sense, centralizers in some respects. So there seems to be a long history in the United States of these kinds of, I don't know if you'd call them, individualizing or decentralizing movements that deny the validity of government in some respects. And there is a hypocrisy involved, because we know that Jefferson exceeded authority and bought territory that he didn't have particularly the constitutional right to do. So is this kind of shallow thinking but deeply rooted anti-government mentality not characteristic of the entire history of the United States?
Yes, it is. But, however deep that goes in our history, including the hypocrisy of homesteaders, for example. I'm thinking of the film, the Swedish film, The New Land, in which the Swedes are settling in Minnesota, and in this totally individualistic sort of environment, but A, they're doing it as a community, and B, they have support of the US military against the Indians. So they have an individualist project which makes no sense without state support and state structures. So the hypocrisy's always been there. But no matter how deep this goes in American history, it didn't rule out the following facts. One, the existence, the early part of last century, of a mass and briefly flourishing socialist party. Two, the existence, only 50 years ago, of a war on poverty declared by a Southern Democrat, Lyndon Johnson, which was supported by a majority of the population. A majority of the population not only supported it, but actually in surveys agreed that they thought poverty could be abolished. That, in other words, there is this collective goal that our government is undertaking for some of us to make our society better. So no matter how individualistic we were, that sense of collectivity was also strong. And I should also point out that the greatest mass leader the United States has produced, certainly in the, perhaps in its whole history, but certainly in the 20th century, Martin Luther King was, towards the end of his life, moving ever more clearly and ever more explicitly towards socialism. And made that clear to all who heard him. So that despite American individualism, there were clearly other trends, and the Tea Party exists as if in a bubble, not aware of any of those trends or any of the history. So we are a peculiar country. We're not Europe on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have become less and less and less collectively oriented than even we were.
But is this an authentic embodiment of that strand of American thinking that is so?
I think it's still deranged.
Atomized.
It's deranged because as Bernstein points out, people live ever more interdependently today compared with the past. I mean, more than ever. And yet they do that in a way in which they see themselves as isolated individuals. There is a contradiction in how people see their experience. If I were to do it in terms of writing everything we live in all our links and connections on a blackboard, and say, this is the map of our social experience, and really take that seriously in all its complexity. Something, by the way, that Elizabeth Warren does in her campaign for Senate in Massachusetts, where she points out the interdependence and connectedness so that even the wealthiest person stands on the shoulders and is dependent on thousands and hundreds of thousands of other people's efforts. If you were to draw a map of that complexity we live, what the Tea Party has done, aided by Fox News, aided by the ideology of the past 35 years, is they've come along and just erased the blackboard and said, I made it myself. It's so crude in this world as to be, as I say, to be demented.
Well, to a large extent, I think part of the problem is that American people tend to be ahistorical, that they don't know American history.
Sure.
They only have sort of this vague perception of what has gone on and the way that it's sort of perpetuated in American culture, of course, is that you isolate different stars, and here's George Washington, here's Thomas Jefferson. You know, it's all very superficial. And if you don't know the history, and if you don't understand all of the nuances or the evolution of society, or the consciousness that has developed, it's very easy for people to perceive of themselves as isolated individuals.
Sure.
And to be mad at the next person who they think is less deserving of, or whatever, what they should be getting.
I think you came in after I laid out some of my explanation for the process, because it is both, it may not hurt to reiterate, there is both a long-term economic process taking place of individualization, some people call it the post-Fordist economy, in which people no longer live and work and experience reality in the same kinds of fairly tight units of the past, both neighborhoods, workplaces, unions, churches, that those experiences of being part of communities have become more and more fragmented, especially in the past 35 years, number one. And number two, there's been a systematic ideological assault in the past 35 years on seeing yourself in connection. So there's the attempted erasure is going on, funded by very wealthy right-wing foundations on the one hand, and the other hand, experience has changed. So that trying to imagine a progressive alternative movement today is very different than 50 years ago. Maybe some of you were here the other evening, last Tuesday, when I had Professor Jeff Ely from the University of Michigan talking about what would be the prerequisites of a socialist movement today compared with 100 years ago. And his point was that the reality has in fundamental ways changed, and such a movement would have to be reconstituted in new ways from new materials. So yes, there's the American history, and yes, there's a strong streak of ignorance and anti-intellectualism, but there are also new waves, new dimensions of experience, and a new ideological project to make us unaware of anything.
The failure of a public education system.
Yeah. Steve.
Okay, I'm trying to, I hope this is as focused as I'd like to be. I found that I was agreeing with everything you said, but at the same time I wasn't sure about your rhetorical emphasis. And it's complicated, but it has to do with, okay, the whole thing about solidarity versus individualism, and of course the fact that in fact the contemporary individual is very socially networked and embedded is true, but of course, but there are a couple of things. One is that even in the stuff you said, certain things get run together. For instance, you mentioned sort of the genealogy of this individualism. You mentioned both what happens in the 1960s and 70s and the kind of economic individual of Thatcher and Reagan. Now, I'm not denying that there's connection there, but of course, the people in the Tea Party are very much, I mean, for the most, there are some genuine quote-unquote libertarians in there, but for the most part, it's people who are, white people who are incredibly racist, straight people who are incredibly homophobic, and men who are incredibly resentful of feminism and of women's gains in the last 40 years. So there's a kind of tension between the fact that this disaggregation, now it's perfectly true that to a certain extent, women in the workforce, so that means that now they can cut people's wages and two people have to work instead of one. But nonetheless, there's a liberating thing which you can't avoid talking about in individualist or disaggregating terms, which is a positive thing, which this whole thing is against. And I think you see that a little bit even within the Occupy movement itself. If you've seen arguments between, say, socialists and anarchists, which have come up in various forms, or when more, not both in the Occupy meetings, as I've read about them in the press, and in sort of more explicit debates by intellectuals or university professors about this stuff. So, I mean, it's sort of like, do you say, do you have a left anti-government rhetoric, or do you say the government ought to, put a tax on these financial houses and actively redistribute money in a different way? So I'm just suggesting both of these things for me kind of complicate the opposition you're being between diluted individualism and the true fact of solidarity.
Yes.
It's more complexly nuanced. And then finally, in terms of rhetorical emphasis, I can't help thinking that the emphasis really should be on political economy, on the fact that we've had a massive redistribution of wealth from the 99% to the 1%, and that's what's being focused on, and that's something which middle-class people as well as poor people actually experience, even though middle-class people have often voted right-wing precisely because of the fear instilled in them of the poor beneath them. I mean, when people, you miss a payment on your credit card by 1 week, and all of a sudden, the next thing you know, you're being sued in court for $5,000 because of all the fees that have agreed. I mean, stuff like this is happening all the time, and it happens in people's personal experience as well, on this much more abstract level where you can see the statistics and how the wealth distribution has changed. So, isn't the need for a focus on that
Sure.
more important maybe than talking about solidarity?
Let me deal with your first point. I don't know if
Yeah.
if everyone understood Professor Shaviro's
Sorry.
first point about individualism. Did you get that? He could be hoisting me by my own petard if he went back to one of the first things I wrote, which was a critique of Herbert Marcuse as his student that I presented in 1969 at the Socialist Scholars Conference. And in that discussion, even today I'm slightly embarrassed as I read it, because it was so powerfully individualistic. And it's very, I wouldn't deny at all that I'm child might be too strong, but certainly a member of the 60s generation and a loyal and absolutely unrepentant member of the 60s generation. I came to Wayne State in 1968 because we thought the revolution was going to happen in Detroit. It didn't. But that seemed to be a good enough reason to come here in my first post-dissertation job. Now, and there was a sense in the late 60s of individual flowering in so many ways. And I embraced that in every possible way. Tony Judt, in writing about what ended the great welfare state from 1945 to 1975, kind of blames the 60s generation, apparently which he didn't really belong to. He was living somewhere else. But he blames the individualism and does not take seriously anymore. I quoted Mark Lilla, who teaches at Columbia and who writes about this whole history. Both of them ignore the fact that 1960s individualism was also profoundly politically committed. That the movement, as we thought of it then, consisted of people who were pursuing a number of tracks of liberation on the one hand, and the other hand, saw themselves as revolutionaries changing the society, and that conviction was as deep as the conviction of individual liberation. That gets forgotten about this generation.
But how do you account for the fact that they're out playing golf today and joining ARP and doing nothing about Social Security? And
some of them are sitting at seminar tables denouncing the Tea Party and talking about Occupy Detroit. So but the point I'm getting at is that the individualism took a very strange turn with Reagan and with Thatcher. And most of the people most deeply committed to the 60s project were repelled by both Reagan and Thatcher. They didn't see this as a further liberation. They saw this as the destruction of all they had believed in. The notion of not just selfishness, but of destroying the results of previous social struggles, of attacking unions, which both of them did, attacking the results of what people working and struggling together had achieved, that was the essence of their program. Deregulating, deregulating, and deregulating. The politically active 60s generation was horrified at all that. So the picture is obviously complicated, and I want to say the economic individualism that is ruining our society and the distorted individualism that does not recognize our social links. But let me put it slightly differently to talk about what individualism means at its deepest. If one talks about a flowering of personality and a development of needs and interests and capacities, one does that both in terms of individual expression and exploration and in terms of one's social connectedness. To not be able to stand on the societal platform that shapes us, to which we belong, makes it a joke, makes it a lie, which is what the Tea Party is all about. Now, I'll skip the second part of your question because we have some others.
So there's been this infographic going around saying that the demographics of the Tea Party and the demographics of the occupiers are very different, whereas the occupiers are younger people who tend to have more employment. The Tea Partiers are older and they tend to be retired. That with the recent statistic that I saw posted that more and more Americans are supportive of wealth redistribution, do you think that this individualism is going away, or do you think it's just people jumping on the bandwagon?
I think it's going to go away. I think, in other words, look, we live a certain reality. These our mental images and our self-conceptions and our ideologies, sooner or later, have to face a sort of ultimate test. Do they make sense of our experience? And we can distort that experience to a considerable amount and live with how we see it in considerable contradiction to the real experience. But there is a real experience, and the real experience is not simply a mental construct. Part of the real experience is our social dependence and our interconnectedness. And people can deny and deny that. But at some point it comes back to bite them. Did it come back to bite people when the market crashed in 2008? Apparently not. It's one of the most amazing facts about the Tea Party is that you have people demanding more of the same policies that caused the crash. That's their response to the crash. To reassert the ideology against the reality that a deregulated, financialized global economy was unsustainable. Now, so at a certain point, let's say in August of 2011, if you're looking at the Tea Party and its political effect in this country and the absence of a movement to the left, you can be totally despairing and say, I guess people just don't and won't get it. But now we see, and this is why I write about hope, and now we see people who have taken some steps to sort of ring a bell and wake people up, waking themselves up, coming into action, coming into a collective relationship with each other, creating a movement of solidarity, and now that's beginning to have effects. So these things happen in pendular ways, right? And I think the momentum is now going in the other direction. How far will it go? How long will it last? We don't know. Say.
Mark, thank you for letting me tape your talk. I really appreciate it. I tend to think in kind of simple terms, so you can elaborate whether I'm correct or not, but isn't one way of writing the history of Western civilization would be the rise of capitalism?
Sure.
From the Renaissance to the present, its progressive takeover of government, the creation of a global trade system. And beginning in the 18th century, you have philosophers saying we have to promote consumerism. And so I think a grand discovery of capitalism was that they could make money off of the individual. And so what you see in television nowadays are pitches to all the varied individual constituencies and an emphasis on individual buying power and individual satisfaction through the market. So your analysis that the individual has been commercialized is absolutely on point. And I think that what's happened here is that one of the tools of capitalism has been the idea of democracy. First postulated as democracy for the wealthy, and then it gradually seeped down into the masses, but then they have to maintain control of the population. And so liberty is something that they can package and sell to everybody, that we're all out there. But because capitalism is undermining every single aspect of life, and the Chinese now want to be capitalists, we're talking about, is the process reversible at all? I mean, even to save the earth, is the process reversible at all?
Right. I agree. I agree with the way you're posing it. I'm not sure it's an essential aspect of what I'm talking about. The question, Marx was considerably an optimist, because he did not anticipate that the economic system and its needs and its drives would not only reshape the polity, but would also begin the process of reshaping individuals themselves. And perhaps that's what's happening. But I'm also suggesting there may be limits to that process. And perhaps what we're seeing is the limits asserting themselves.
I think you saw, that's a contestation of Western civilization between that tendency and then, for example, the tendency of the Romantic movement in the 19th century and even earlier to say, we have to have some sort of communal, some sort of spiritual. Yeah. It keeps reoccurring.
Right. But of course, capitalism is not a totally, entirely, and that's what Marx understood as well, individualistic system, because it's based on, it's a particular, it's a system which permits individual appropriation and command over social resources. And he understood that these were social resources and social processes that happened to be organized according to an individual-centered profit system. And I'm saying part of what we need to do, and part of what I think Occupy Detroit is doing, is looking deeper, looking at the connections. And indeed, the connections are there. All one has to do is sort of lift off some of the ideology and see the map I talked about earlier. What's the map of how we interact, how we get our food, how we get our clothes, where our clothes come from, and so on.
I just keep thinking about that idea of the map, and what strikes me, and I think this is part of what you're saying as well, but I guess I wanted to ask you to comment on it, maybe develop it, is that it's a very different experience to depend on, let's say, buying your food at a store through a relationship that's fully commodified.
Yes.
Than to depend on more personal kinds of relationships. And so the fully commoditized or commodified relationship allows people to experience it not as dependence, but as, it's my own choice.
That's right.
I'm not depending on anybody. I paid for it, so I don't owe anybody anything, and it remains. I mean, there's a sort of ideological effect built into the relationship, built into the transaction, that allows people not to experience it as social interdependence, but as independence.
Independence, free choice, that's right, absolutely right. There's the illusion of a solely individual experience. And one of the things you see is people rebelling against that. The spread of markets, of farmers markets, sure. Eastern Market, Royal Oak Farmers Market, the fact that more and more people are looking away from corporately produced food, meat, and so on, and wanting to buy from the individual producer, and that's slowly becoming a value, which is interesting. Buy from small stores. There's a commercialized program. Now, you'll see ads on TV. On November 26th, shop from small stores. Do your Christmas shopping at small stores. So there's some people at least are beginning to rebel against that totally, what should we say, anesthetized, abstract relationship and want some sense of connectedness. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay. Oh, yeah, last one.
Real quick question. You're talking about like how the Tea Party was a new form of individualism, and how it, through the modern era, like things have began to change. And you also mentioned briefly that like the solidarity that's being produced in the Occupy movement is also like being reconstituted or constituted in different ways. I wonder like if there are concerns about the different ways that it's being constituted, like particularly through like mediated communication. We can talk about making those relationships, but many times those relationships are being made like not on a personal basis, but
like Facebook and Twitter.
Facebook, Twitter, like live streaming, like
Yeah.
don't have to be there, can just
Right.
watch on TV. I can order a pizza for the people in Occupy Wall Street at any time I want, you know, and I just like wonder if like those sorts of things are like,
Yeah.
if it's making it more accessible, but at the same time hurting those relationships that we're trying to build.
Right. On the one hand. On the other hand, there's the people's mic.
Mm-hmm.
And the relaying of what the speaker is saying through the crowd by people repeating it directly. Well, in Zuccotti Park, that was required because of the absence of a speaker system. But at Grand Circus Park, there's no problem getting a speaker system in, but that's done as a point of process. How do we want to interact? Do we want to interact with bullhorns and loudspeakers, or do we want to repeat and make it more sort of more direct and more connected, so that we can, because part of the issue here is can we feel, can we experience our sense of collectivity? And to go back to the other point, which is an important point, do we experience ourselves as belonging? The sense of solidarity is not an abstract thing. You experience yourself as belonging to a larger group, a larger community. And that larger community, may not have any ultimate limits. You experience yourself as belonging there, and to what extent does the means of doing it, the media means, diminish the actual community? We could just end that as a question, which needs to be thought about. My guess is what you're going to see if the Occupy movements continue is a combination of both. Tahrir Square, massive demonstrations, people there, present, on the one hand. On the other hand, Twitter, Facebook, people being connected, cell phones being connected, using the media, but only using it. That's sort of the question. Okay, thank you all.